What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Before we get into today's video, just a quick reminder. If you enjoy the stories, please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have any thoughts about the stories, drop them in the comments below. Reading what you guys have to say is honestly one of my favorite parts of doing this. If you've got a story of your own you'd like to share, check the description. You'll find links to my email, Facebook, and Twitter. You can message me on any of those, and I'll do my best to feature your story in a future video. If you send one in, please include how you'd like to be credited in the video description, along with a title for your story, and any themes it might fall under. With all that out of the way, let's get into today's true scary stories. I hope you enjoy, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again tomorrow. I went through a really strange phase in my life where I basically had nowhere to live. I just graduated college, was about to get kicked out of the dorms, and I wasn't making nearly enough to afford my own place. All my friends were either moving back in with their parents or leaving town entirely, so crashing with them wasn't an option. Time was running out fast, and I desperately needed something cheap and a roommate to split the costs with. One day, an ad popped up on a rental site. A guy named Xander was looking for a roommate to share the house he was renting. The place looked small, which I assumed meant it would be affordable. I replied, and later that same day he called. We set up a tour, agreed on a price, and I moved in. It wasn't ideal, but it was far from the worst situation. Xander and I actually got along really well. He just graduated too, so we were in similar boats, both kind of floundering and trying to figure things out. It was nice having someone who understood that. The house itself was pretty run down and only had one bedroom, which meant my room was the living room. But I was gone most of the time working, so I convinced myself it was fine. About a week after I'd fully settled in, something happened. It was the middle of the night. I was asleep on the couch in the living room when I heard the front door open. I looked up and saw Xander come in. He glanced over at me, but I don't think he realized I was awake. He walked past me down the hall to his room. I heard him moving stuff around in there for a bit. Then he came back into the hallway and walked toward the front door again. This time he stopped, turned, and just stared at me. He stood there looking at me for a good 5 to 10 seconds, expressionless, before going back outside. Something about the way he moved and the way he watched me made my skin crawl. A few minutes later, I heard movement right outside the door. When it opened, I quickly closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. His breathing was heavy as he stepped inside and started down the hallway. When he was almost to his room, I cracked my eyes open a sliver and saw Xander cradling what looked very much like a human body in his arms. He moved quickly into his room and slammed the door. I just sat there, frozen, my heart hammering. For a moment, I actually wondered if I'd imagined it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some drunk friend he was letting crash. Maybe I'd seen it wrong in the dark. I sat up quietly and crept down the hall to listen at his door. Inside, I could hear him moving around non-stop. The longer I stood there, the more the unease turned into outright fear. After a minute of pacing back and forth in the hall, I made a decision and knocked. All the movement stopped instantly. There was a long, heavy silence. Then I heard the lock click and the door opened just a crack, only enough for me to see a narrow strip of his face. He apologized for waking me and said he was just rearranging some things. He said it so casually and so obviously untruthfully that I just blurted out, "What were you holding when you came in? Was that a person?" His expression went flat, but his eyes changed in a way I'd never seen before, cold, hard, almost dead. He just stared at me without replying. The tension spiked so fast I acted on pure instinct. I threw my shoulder into the door as hard as I could. It burst open and knocked Xander backward. From over his shoulder, I saw into the room. There, shoved into a corner, was a body, completely limp, completely lifeless. Xander scrambled up, shoved me out of the doorway with surprising force, and slammed the door in my face. The lock clicked again. I'd seen more than enough. I sprinted back to the living room, grabbed my phone, and ran out of the house before dialing 911. Xander never tried to run. When the police arrived, he cooperated completely, but it didn't matter. The person in his room had already been dead for hours. The cops didn't share many details afterward. I only found out a couple of things. Xander had lied about his age. He was actually close to 30, and whatever he'd done that night was serious enough that he's still in prison to this day. He's never talked, as far as I know, about why he did it or what exactly he planned to do with the body. I consider myself very lucky I got out when I did. I still sometimes think about what might have happened if I'd confronted him differently, or not at all. Something strange happened to me last summer. I live alone in a house that's a bit out in the country. The road in front of my property is fairly busy, but my yard is large and my house sits well back from the road, at the end of a long driveway. The whole property is about 7 acres. Near the road I've got a mailbox by the driveway, a line of trees for privacy, and a wide stretch of grass. One morning I went outside and immediately noticed something was off. There was a car parked in my front yard. It was sitting right at the far edge of my grass, about 50 feet from my driveway, angled toward the road so passing drivers could easily see it. When I walked up to it, I realized it was a car for sale, a red 2002 Dodge Neon, with a price and a phone number scrawled on a sign in the window. Someone had decided my property was a free used car lot. Annoyed, I pulled out my phone and called the number. A man answered. I asked if he was selling the Neon and he said yes. I told him it was parked in my front yard and that he needed to move it. I suggested he find some spot along the road that wasn't privately owned. He claimed his buddy had told him he knew me and that I was fine with it. When I asked the buddy's name, he said John Newman. I don't know anyone named John Newman. At that point it was obvious he was just making things up. I told him again to move the car as soon as possible. He said he would, then hung up. I kept an eye out most of the day, but no one ever came. By the time I went to bed that night, the car was still there, sitting in my yard like a giant red insult. The next morning, around 7 a.m., I stepped outside and saw the car was gone. Looked like he'd come by sometime in the night and moved it. Weird, but at least it was off my property. Then I noticed my mailbox. It was snapped clean in half and lying on the ground. The post was splintered. The box itself was smashed like it had been run over. I didn't need to be a detective to guess who was responsible. I called the same number again and told him he'd destroyed my mailbox. Of course, he denied it. I lost my temper and told him he could either come back and fix it or buy me a new one, or I'd call the police. He didn't argue. He just hung up. After pacing around for a while, I decided not to bother calling the cops. It wasn't worth the headache over a mailbox, and honestly, I doubted they'd do much. I went out and bought a new one myself. I really thought that would be the end of it. That night, around 9 or 10 p.m., I was alone in the kitchen when I heard a noise out front. Even though I live off a busy road, it's usually dead quiet by that time of night, and I rarely hear anything actually on my property. Curious, I went to the front window and peeked out. A man was standing near my car in the driveway, poking around. I had a strong feeling it was the same guy who'd parked the Neon on my lawn. He was dressed in dark clothes with a hood pulled up over his head, hiding most of his face. I went to the front door, opened it, and called out, asking what he was doing. He turned toward me and stared for a second or two, then started walking directly at me. I had no idea what he might do if he reached me. I shut the door and locked it immediately. He came right up to it and tugged at the handle a couple of times, testing it. Then I heard his footsteps pounding away down the driveway, back toward the road. I watched from the window for a while but never saw him again. Eventually, I went outside with a flashlight and checked around to make sure he was really gone. He was. Nothing else out of the ordinary has happened since. I still don't know why that guy fixated on my property of all places, but I'm just glad it seems to be over. This next thing happened just a few hours ago during my night shift, and for some reason it really shook me. I'm a police officer in a large city. I'm used to dealing with horrible sights and smells on a daily basis. Between the violence, the accidents, and the mental health crises, you build up a thick skin whether you want to or not. But this was different. It was just wrong. We have a big homeless population here, and a lot of people struggle with mental illness and substance abuse. It's not unusual to see someone acting strangely at night. As long as they're not hurting themselves or anyone else, I try to leave them alone. It was around 11 p.m. I was at a red light on a very dark, quiet street. Mine was the only car around. I glanced to my right to just scan the area, and that's when I saw him. A skinny man in ragged clothes was on the sidewalk in the most unnatural position I'd ever seen. His feet were flat on the ground. His hands were on the ground above his head. His stomach was arched high up toward the sky, like he was bending backward into an impossible bridge. I remember thinking, that's odd. While holding that position, he suddenly snapped his head toward me in one violent motion, stared straight at my cruiser, then whipped his head back toward the sky. And then he started moving. He did that exorcist-style spider walk, back arched, limbs twisted, head thrown back, scuttling toward my car at a speed that didn't look human. It looked like that was the only way he'd ever learned to walk. All I could think was, what the hell? The light turned green and I drove off before he could get close. I've seen dead bodies, shootings, all of it. But that one moment, that unnatural way he moved, disturbed me more than I can explain. It was like a scene ripped straight out of a horror movie. This next story happened in 1985 when I was 18. My family, my parents, my 16-year-old sister Amani and me, lived in a quiet neighborhood in Calgary. To me, everything about our life was perfect. Everything except our neighbor, David. I hated David. He was 22, full of himself, and played electric guitar in some local rock band. He constantly had different women over, and from my sister's bedroom window she could hear everything. You can imagine what I mean by that. Whenever Amani and I walked home from school, David would just happen to be in his front yard, shirtless, doing bicep curls. Without fail, he'd try to start a conversation with her. She'd politely say hi back, but his attention always made me feel sick. The way he stared at her, intense, unblinking, felt predatory. Now I'll tell you what happened to my sister. One sweltering Saturday night, our parents were out for some reason. I was in my room, and Amani had gone to bed early. Sometime in the night, she woke up to the sound of her window blinds clattering. When she turned on the light, she saw David climbing in through her bedroom window. She was so shocked she couldn't even scream. He told her not to make a sound, said he needed something from her. She started to cry, convinced he was going to assault her and then kill her. He grabbed her face gently with one hand, wiping away her tears like he was comforting her. Then, in this flat, matter-of-fact voice, he told her he was going to marry her. He pulled out a ring and said his mother had given it to him to present to a special girl one day. He started rambling about how they'd moved to Mexico or South America together and run away from everything. She tried to tell him no, but his hand tightened on her face. She raised her voice and pushed him away. His demeanor changed instantly. He hit her and told her that if she refused again, he would kill her and me that very night. The fear was so overwhelming that she fainted. I heard the loud thump of her body hitting the floor through the wall and knew something was wrong. I ran to her room. When I burst in, I found David inside, holding my unconscious sister in his arms in a bridal carry, like some twisted groom. The entire room reeked of alcohol. He was dead drunk. I screamed at him. The sound startled him enough that he dropped her on the floor. Then he dove back out the window and vanished into the night. I called the police immediately. David didn't go to jail, but he was put on house arrest and forced to complete mandatory anger management classes. My parents weren't satisfied with that, and neither was I. We moved away not long after. To this day, I still get sick thinking about how close we were to something far worse happening. When I was 5 years old, I walked to the school bus stop by myself every morning. One morning, as I stood there waiting, A car pulled up beside me. Two men were inside. The one in the passenger seat leaned out and asked, "Hey, have you seen our dog?" They obviously didn't have a dog with them, but I was a clueless kid. I asked, "What kind of dog is it?" "It's a husky," he replied. "I haven't seen it," I said. He smiled and said, "Why don't you come with us and help us look for the puppy?" I was about to get into the car. The man even had a hand on my arm, guiding me toward the door. That's when my bus pulled up early, for once. I told them I had to go to school and yanked my arm away, running onto the bus before it could drive off. A week or two later, news spread that two young girls had been found in a field. They'd been raped and beaten with some kind of large, blunt object. One of them died. The other survived and told the police that two men had approached her asking for help looking for a husky. To this day, I'm convinced that if that bus hadn't come early, I would have ended up in that field. I remember throwing a block party in college. I invited all the young people from the neighborhood. Most of them I knew pretty well. There were some acquaintances, sure, but I was familiar with everyone there. We were a couple of hours in, the fire was going. Everyone was laughing and drinking. That's when he showed up. Out of nowhere, some random guy none of us had ever seen hopped the back fence and slipped into the yard. That fence just bordered a forested area. No houses, no lights. He'd come straight out of the pitch-black woods. When I say he joined the party, I don't mean he grabbed a drink and introduced himself. He never said a single word. He just hung back in the shadows, watching us, staring. People noticed him because how could you not? But no one knew who he was, and every time someone half approached, he seemed to drift just out of the way. At some point before the night was fully over, he disappeared. No one saw him leave. One moment he was there, lurking by the tree line, and the next he was. After the last of my guests said their goodbyes, I doused the bonfire and called my dog inside. Right before I stepped through the door, something caught my eye, just a faint flash of white movement near the fence. I looked closer. He was there, standing partially hidden among the trees beyond the fence line, just watching me. Not moving, not speaking. I went inside, grabbed my rifle, and fired a warning shot into the air. He didn't flinch, didn't duck, didn't run. He just kept staring at me for a long moment, then slowly turned around and walked back into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. I called the police. They searched the area but never found anyone. I still don't know what he wanted, or how long he'd been watching us before he decided to hop that fence. This next story happened when I was 22, so a little more than 10 years ago now. At the time, I was still trying to figure out what to do with my life. I'd tried college, but it wasn't really for me. While I was there, though, I met a guy whose family owned a construction and contracting company. They did everything. Built structures, did renovations, plowed driveways in the winter. We became friends, and soon enough I started working for his family's company. Within a couple of months, I'd made more money than I had in the entire previous year at my last job. The work was hard and physical, but it paid well and felt satisfying. That summer, I stayed in my college town just to keep working. When fall rolled around, instead of going back to school, I dropped out and committed to the company full-time. By the end of that first year, I was making enough to live on my own. Then a big job came up. We landed a contract to build a bridge in a small town about an hour away. The pay was incredible, but there was a catch. The work would be basically 72 hours straight. Long days, little sleep. Still, the payout would be enough for me to put a down payment on a starter home, so I was all in. We pushed through the job, got the bridge finished, checked everything over to make sure it was up to code, and finally wrapped up. Completely exhausted but proud, I was ready to go home and collapse. Instead, one of my coworkers suggested we go out for some beers to celebrate. Looking back, I should have gone straight home and passed out. But the idea of blowing off steam with my friends after such a brutal job sounded too good to pass up. So we went to a bar. While we were there, I noticed a woman sitting at the far side of the room. She kept glancing over at me. Maybe it was the confidence from finishing the job. maybe the thought of having extra money soon, or maybe just the drinks. But I decided to go talk to her. To my surprise, she seemed genuinely interested. We started with small talk, which quickly turned into deeper conversation. I won't go into all the details, but I started getting the sense that we might end up back at my place. Then I noticed her smile slowly fading. She kept looking past me toward the other side of the bar, her expression tightening. I finally asked what was wrong. She told me that the man sitting across from us was her ex, and that he was extremely jealous. I told her we could move, and she liked that idea. My group of friends and I picked up and moved to a table near the back of the bar. From there, her supposed ex was out of sight, and we quickly forgot about him. For about 10 minutes. Then I saw the same frown creep back onto her face. Before I could ask, she pointed out another guy in the bar and told me that was also an ex, and that he was just as jealous and possessive as the first one. At that point, I started to feel suspicious. I wondered if she was playing some kind of weird game with me. Maybe it was all a coincidence, but the story was starting to sound ridiculous. Before I could overthink it too much, she suggested we leave the bar altogether and go back to my place for a few more drinks. Tired, tipsy, and more than a little flattered, I agreed. We got to my tiny studio apartment a little after 1 a.m. I was mentally and physically drained from 3 days of work, but the adrenaline and excitement of the night kept me going. I put on some music, got us drinks, and tried to turn on the charm, what little I had left. But her demeanor had changed. She seemed distant and dismissive, barely reacting to anything I said. Instead, she kept checking her phone over and over. I didn't ask what she was doing. It wasn't really my business, and I didn't want to seem controlling or paranoid. Then there was a knock at my door. The sound nearly made my heart stop. It was 1 a.m. I hadn't slept properly in days, and I wasn't exactly expecting visitors. I stood there, weighing my options. The music wasn't loud, so it seemed unlikely it was a noise complaint. I was trying to decide whether to answer or ignore it when she suddenly stood up and, in this annoyed tone, said, "I guess I'll get it then." I jumped up and asked what the hell she was doing. "What does it look like?" she snapped. "I'm answering the door." A sick feeling flooded my stomach as she opened it. The man from the far side of the bar walked in like he owned the place. A moment later, the second guy she pointed out followed him inside. Before I could react, the first one leaned in close and hissed that if I made a sound, my night was going to get a whole lot worse. I saw the outline of some kind of weapon tucked into his waistband. The other guy pulled a knife and demanded my wallet and any other valuables I had. I didn't argue. I handed over my wallet right away. The nice thing, if you can call it that, was that my studio was tiny and pretty bare. I didn't own much of value because I'd been saving everything for a house. I had very little cash and no fancy electronics or jewelry. While the one with the knife stood in front of me, the other guy and the woman started searching through my apartment for anything else worth taking. After a few minutes, apparently disappointed, they fled with basically just my wallet. I waited a couple of minutes, frozen, convinced they might still be right outside the door waiting for me to do something stupid. Once I felt reasonably sure they'd gone, I called the police. Only then did it hit me that I didn't even know the woman's name for sure, let alone have her number. All I had for the cops was a description of her and the 2 men, and the suggestion that they might show up on the bar's security cameras. They must have decided against using my debit card, because no transactions ever showed up. I left the card active for a few days to see if they'd slip up and create a trail, but nothing ever appeared. Finally, I canceled it. I was certain they'd all be caught eventually, but I never heard anything from the police. I never saw any of them again, and the bar staff didn't recognize my descriptions when I asked around later. In the end, I lost about $20 in cash and a debit card with hardly any money in the account. Compared to what could have happened, I was very lucky. Still, that night stays with me. It's a permanent reminder to be careful who you trust, especially when you've been drinking and you're exhausted. She seemed great at first, Or maybe I was just too tired to see the red flags she practically waved in my face. This next thing happened about 6 years ago. It was one of the scariest road rage incidents I've ever experienced. At the time, I worked about 50 miles away from the town where my wife and I lived. We were saving for our first house and renting a cheap 2-bedroom apartment with our young son, Jacob. Jobs in our town didn't pay well, so I had to commute pretty far every day for decent money. We only had one car, which meant my wife, Connie, was stuck at home most days. Normally, that wasn't a huge issue. She spent most of her time taking care of Jacob and handling things around the apartment. One morning, around lunchtime, I got a worried call from her. Jacob had been fussy all night, which we chalked up to his age at first, but by late morning he'd spiked a nasty fever and was clearly miserable. Connie had called our doctor, who squeezed us in for an appointment that afternoon. She asked me to come home and go with them. I told my boss what was going on and asked to take the rest of the day off. He was understanding, especially since Jacob was our first child, and I was more anxious than I probably needed to be. It turned out to be just a simple cold, but with kids that small, you can never be too careful. I got in the car and headed home. I was distracted the entire drive, calling home every 15 minutes to get updates on Jacob and make sure Connie was okay. About 10 miles from home, I needed to take my exit off the freeway. Still on the phone and preoccupied, I checked my mirrors way too quickly and started merging into the right lane. I didn't see the car sitting in my blind spot. The blare of a horn snapped me back. We came within a hair of colliding, but somehow we both managed to brake and swerve just enough to avoid impact. My heart was pounding. I glanced in my rearview mirror and gave the driver an apologetic, my bad gesture. I assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. I exited the freeway and drove about half a mile down the access road when I noticed the same car still behind me. The driver was right on my bumper, his face twisted with rage. He stuck his arms out the window, shouting and gesturing wildly. I couldn't hear him, but I could tell he was furious. He started tailgating me and leaning on his horn. Every time I sped up to put some distance between us, he did the same. I was genuinely afraid he'd ram me if I slowed down even a little. Connie was still on the phone, hearing all the honking in the background and asking what was going on. I tried not to panic her, but when the guy suddenly pulled into the oncoming lane and started driving alongside me on the wrong side of the road, I couldn't hide it anymore. I told her to hang up with me and call the police, then explain what was happening and where I was. With my attention fully on the road, I tried to figure out what this guy's endgame was. If he got in front of me, what was he planning to do? Box me in, force me off the road. For a few tense minutes, he stayed either glued to my bumper or right beside me on the wrong side of the street. Luckily, a semi-truck hauling gasoline pulled into the lane between us at one point. The truck driver probably had no idea what was going on, but his sheer size gave me just enough breathing room to make a quick right turn toward my neighborhood without the guy immediately cutting me off. I thought I'd shaken him, but he appeared again at the next intersection, still on my tail. Now I was only a few blocks from home. In hindsight, I should not have led him to where I lived, but in the moment, home was the only place I could think of that felt safe. I just hoped the police would be there waiting. As I turned onto the road leading to our apartment complex, my stomach dropped. During the day, the gates were left open. He could easily follow me right in. Then I saw them. 2 police cruisers were parked right by the manager's office. I pulled into the complex and drove straight between the 2 patrol cars. The enraged driver followed me inside, then abruptly stopped, slammed his car into reverse, and sped backward out the gate, disappearing down the road. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, fighting back a huge wave of emotion. Call it relief, adrenaline, or just plain fear, but it was overwhelming. Once I calmed down enough to talk, I got out and gave the officers the man's license plate number and described what had happened. I never found out if they actually tracked him down, but I hope they at least scared him enough to think twice before doing something like that again. Despite everything, Connie and I still made it to Jacob's appointment. He was back to his normal self a few days later. For the next few weeks, I altered my routes and schedules, just in case that guy was hanging around looking for me. He never showed. Maybe nothing would have happened anyway, but in today's world people can and do kill over the smallest driving mistake. Keep your attention on the road. You never know who's behind you. My college campus includes a pretty large nature preserve. During the day, it's mostly used by biology and environmental science students, plus the occasional hiker. At night, it turns into a hangout spot for stoners and people watching the stars. There are all kinds of stories about the woods being haunted. The most common rumor is that the ghosts of two students who hanged themselves out there still wander among the trees. One night, a friend and I went for a hike to watch the supermoon. On the way back, we had to cross this pond. There's a long wooden bridge that stretches across the middle of it, maybe 150 yards from end to end. It's the only way in or out toward the road. About halfway across, there's a little bump out on the side where people can step aside and not block foot traffic. As we stepped onto the bridge, my flashlight beam swept ahead and caught two dark figures standing right there in that little alcove. Not wanting to blind anyone, I immediately switched the light off. My friend joked, "Wow, what an asshole shining that right in people's eyes." We kept walking. When we reached the alcove, there was no one there. They couldn't have just hurried past us. The boards on that bridge are loud and creaky as hell. Every footstep echoes over the water. We hadn't heard anything. We stopped and looked around, shining the light carefully over the rails and the water, scanning for any sign of them. Nothing. As we were turning to continue, a long, quiet giggle floated around us out of nowhere. It didn't come from any one direction. It felt like it was all around us at once, then slowly faded away. Nothing anyone says will ever convince me that wasn't the ghosts of those two students. Back in college, I went to film school and I absolutely loved it. I met a ton of great people, learned a lot, and got to make short films, which was the best part for me, being able to tell stories with my own vision. The only problem was that I had a hard time brainstorming ideas on campus. The dorms, the library, all the usual spots just didn't spark anything creatively. So whenever I needed to come up with ideas, I'd go for long drives at night. I'd put on some music, hit the road, and just let my mind wander. On one of those night drives, I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror. They were getting closer fast, and it looked like I was being pulled over. I eased over to the side of the road and stopped. The vehicle pulled up behind me, and the lights went off. I sat there for a minute or two, trying to figure out what I could have done wrong. I turned off the car, took the key out, and set it on the dashboard. I'd always heard you should do that when you're pulled over to show you're not going anywhere. In the dark, I tried to make out details in the mirror, but it was too dim. It looked like the outline of a pickup truck, which struck me as odd. I'd never seen a cop driving a pickup before, at least not as a patrol vehicle. I started to wonder if this even was a cop. Finally, a figure climbed out of the truck. As he walked toward my car, I could clearly see he was wearing black pants and a black hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. No uniform, no badge, no reflective vest, nothing. Every alarm bell in my brain was going off. But I didn't speed away. A part of me still worried, what if this really is some kind of plainclothes officer? If I take off, I'll be in even more trouble. He staggered a little as he approached, like he was unsteady on his feet. By the time he reached my window, rolled down about a quarter of the way, I could see most of his face despite the hood. He started yelling at me to get out of the car right now. That's when the smell hit me. His breath reeked of alcohol. It had taken me this long to fully accept that this was not a cop. I shouted no and grabbed my keys off the dashboard, fumbling around in the dark to find the ignition. My hands were shaking. He yelled again for me to get out immediately. Then he lifted his sweatshirt and started to pull something from his waistband. It looked like a firearm. I ducked down, jammed the key into the ignition, slammed the car into gear and floored it. I didn't feel safe for even a second, because within moments his truck roared after me. He didn't turn his lights back on, but he tailgated me so closely I could barely see his headlights. Every time I changed lanes, he mirrored me perfectly. The speed limit on that dark road was 45. I was pushing 65, maybe more, trying to lose him. Before I knew it, I was nearly 30 minutes away from campus, and he was still locked onto my bumper. Up ahead, I saw an on-ramp for the highway and decided to try something I'd only ever seen in movies. I waited until the very last second, then jerked the wheel and shot onto the ramp, forcing him to either miss it or crash if he tried to follow. 2 long minutes passed. No headlights in my mirror. Assuming I'd finally shaken him, I didn't get off at the next exit. I was sure he might anticipate that. Instead, I made an illegal U-turn on the empty highway, crossed over to the other side, and headed back the opposite direction. I took the same exit I'd just come from, but going the other way. I had no real idea where I was. I drove slowly along side streets until I spotted a 24-hour gas station. I pulled in, went inside, and told the clerk what had happened, begging him to call the police. I also had to ask for directions back to my school. This was before everyone had smartphones with GPS. I had a brick-style cell phone that I usually kept in my dorm, not on me. When the cops arrived, I gave them all the details I could, which wasn't much. It had been dark, I hadn't gotten a license plate, and a guy in a hoodie driving a pickup truck isn't exactly rare. The officer was honest and said they probably would never find out who the man was. Still, he was kind enough to escort me back to campus, just in case that guy tried to come looking for me. I think about that night often. I still beat myself up for pulling over at all and not reacting faster. Now, whenever a pickup is tailgating me at night, I'm immediately transported back to that moment on the side of the road, with a drunk stranger and his hand going for a hidden weapon. I really hope that all these years later, that man never got the chance to do that to anyone else. I remember one time, back in the day, I friend-zoned a guy I knew. He'd been okay with it at first, or at least that's how it seemed. We stayed in touch and hung out in a group sometimes. He came across as a normal, decent friend. One night he pulled me aside away from everyone else. His expression was strange, and before I could ask what was wrong, he pulled out a knife. He told me that if I didn't go on a date with him, he was going to kill me and rape me so that nobody else could ever have me. Everything inside me wanted to scream or run, but somehow I managed to stay calm. I don't know how, but I kept my voice steady and tried to reason with him, talking slowly and gently. I told him it didn't have to be like this, that he'd ruin his own life, that we could just walk away and forget it. We went back and forth like that for what felt like forever, probably around half an hour. Incredibly, it worked. Eventually, his grip on the knife loosened, his shoulders sagged a little, and he just backed off. He put the knife away, turned, and left. He never hurt me. He never tried anything like that again. That night taught me 2 things. First, that under pressure, I'm somehow able to stay calm even when my life feels like it's on the line. And second, that a seemingly normal friend can flip and become terrifyingly dangerous in the space of a few minutes. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here again. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the stories, please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel like it. It really helps the channel out a lot. If you have any feedback for me, I'd love to hear it down in the comments as well. If you have a story you'd like to send in, or if you want to contact me for any reason, you'll find links to my social media in the description below: Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter. Feel free to send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. If you do decide to submit a story, please include in the subject line or first message what you'd like the story to be titled, if it has a title, what kind of story it is, creepy encounter, paranormal, true crime, etc., and how you'd like to be credited in the description of the video. Your name, a nickname, anonymous, whatever you prefer. including as much detail as you're comfortable with, and using reasonably clear grammar will give your story the best chance of being featured in a future video. That's pretty much it for now. Thank you guys again for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.